Hey guys, tonight we set sail under a canopy of stars so clear and crisp it's like someone peeled the sky open just for you. The ocean stretches out forever, gentle and dark. And every creak of the ship sounds oddly louder than it should. Wooden planks shifting beneath your feet, ropes groaning softly above. The only thing telling you which way is which tiny points of light millions of miles away, which you're somehow expected to use to find land you've never seen. You stand at the edge of an old wooden deck, maybe a bit seasick, maybe a bit sleepy. You've memorized a few star patterns, Orion's Belt, the Big Dipper, maybe even the Southern Cross if you're ambitious, but honestly, everything up there just looks like glitter tossed by a mildly vengeful sky god. And still, you're supposed to use all of that to cross thousands of miles of ocean, with nothing but some half-burnt maps, a compass that sulks on cloudy days, and a ship that smells like old cheese and unwashed socks. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly across the pitching deck wrapped in layers of damp wool and salt-stiff linen. The night is deceptively peaceful with a breeze so mild, you might forget that you're weeks from land low on fresh water. And relying on the same star charts your captain's uncle scribbled on a goat's hide after one too many drinks. Navigation in its early days was less science and more polite guessing. Mariners knew the stars moved in predictable patterns, but using that knowledge required patience, mathematics, and clear skies. Miss even one of those, and well, let's just say Columbus thought he'd landed in Asia when he hit the Bahamas, and he wasn't even embarrassed about it. You learn quickly that a lot of early sailors operated on vibes. There were no GPS satellites blinking helpfully above you. There wasn't even a basic globe everyone agreed on. Sometimes you'd sail in the opposite direction of where you thought land was, simply because the wind wouldn't cooperate. And turning around wasn't an option when your ship was basically a glorified bathtub with a tarp. You spend long hours staring upward, hoping the stars will be kind tonight. The North Star Polaris is your anchor. It never moves and it always points north. That's helpful. Ish. But even Polaris has its limits. It's not visible from the southern hemisphere. Oops. You try to sleep on deck, but it's like trying to nap on a seesaw made of barrels. Below deck, it's worse. Hot, musty, crowded with rats, snoring men, and the occasional misplaced chicken. You start to wonder if the stars are laughing at you. Still, you've got a sense of wonder. There's something timeless about looking up and seeing exactly what ancient Egyptian priests saw, what Polynesian navigators read like a book, what Viking explorers used to cross entire oceans in longships that make yours look luxurious. Historians still argue whether sailors truly understood the stars, or if they just repeated techniques they didn't fully grasp. You wouldn't be surprised if both were true. One sailor swears by the stars, another swears at them. Either way, you nod and pretend you understand, because that's what you do when you're trapped on a boat with these people for 6 months. You meet a grizzled old helmsman with a nose like a weather-beaten potato. He tells you about star compasses pointing to where certain constellations rise and set. He tells stories of traders from Arabia, of Chinese junk ships using star height to gauge latitude. You listen half impressed, half wishing for just one working clock. On rare nights, the sky is so clear the Milky Way spills across it like powdered sugar on velvet. You trace lines between stars with your finger, guessing at patterns that might help. There's a comfort in it, a reminder that while you may be lost, you're not the first to feel this way. You find yourself whispering to the stars after a while. Not prayers exactly. Just questions. Like, is this the right way, or what are the odds this island actually exists? The stars don't answer, but they don't mock you either. And that somehow is enough. Your captain, meanwhile, is drawing with charcoal on damp parchment, reinventing maps that already exist, but with a bit more drama. Add a serpent there, he says, gesturing to an uncharted bit of ocean, just in case. It's hard to believe, but even today, some ancient maps still bear the outlines of continents that don't exist. They were drawn based on second-hand accounts, wishful thinking, or just artistic flair. And every one of them was used seriously by men who believed that stars would guide them safely to their golden shores. They didn't always. But sometimes when everything went wrong, no wind, No land in sight spoiled food. A rebellious crew, it was the stars that gave explorers the will to keep going. Not because the stars guaranteed success, but because they reminded you there was still order out there. Still light. And tonight as you drift off in your hammock or curl up under the stars, it's that quiet glow above that makes all the difference. Not because it tells you exactly where you are, but because it helps you believe that somewhere still exists. You wake up to shouting again. A deckhand swears he's spotted land, but it turns out to be a cloud, shaped like a lumpy potato. It's the third false alarm this week, and your captain's already chewed through half his beard in frustration. Still, you can't really blame the guy. After all, even with the trusty North Star, half of early navigators still managed to get spectacularly gloriously lost. Polaris, the North Star, is the golden child of celestial navigation. It sits almost perfectly above the North Pole, making it a dependable guide if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. You just measure how high it sits above the horizon and voila, that's your latitude. It's a solid trick. But let's not pretend it was foolproof. You try it yourself, one clear night. You squint through a brass instrument your quartermaster calls a cross staff. You tilt it up, nearly poke your eye out, and scribble some numbers. The captain looks over your shoulder, frowns, and mutters something about you needing to aim better next time. Great. You're 700 miles off course and also slightly blind in your left eye. And even when Polaris worked other stars, didn't. They moved. Or they vanished behind clouds. Or if you were sailing far south, they just didn't appear at all. The Southern Hemisphere, for instance, doesn't have a bright pole star. So sailors down there had to invent whole new systems just to stay afloat sometimes, literally. Historians still argue whether ancient seafarers really understood the subtle drift of the night sky. Precession of the equinoxes. Star magnitude charts. Probably not. More likely, they passed down patterns orally with just enough accuracy to survive, but not enough to prevent a few enthusiastic detours into, say, uninhabitable wastelands. Even in the golden age of exploration, knowing north wasn't the same as knowing where north was. One wrong calculation, one shaky hand, and suddenly your ship's heading due west when you thought you were slicing neatly toward the Spice Islands. You overhear the captain one evening muttering something about dead reckoning and slaps a chart with the back of his hand, like it insulted his mother. We should have seen land 2 days ago, he huffs. Then he stares at the stars with that same look your uncle gives the microwave when it's acting suspicious. A lot of this frustration comes down to magnetic compasses, which sound helpful until you realize that magnetic north is not the same as true north. That's the kind of realization that leads to shouting mutiny and possibly sobbing over spilled grog. Without proper adjustments for magnetic declination, sailors could be off by dozens, sometimes hundreds of miles, and not even know it until the rum ran out. You start to notice the little things that throw off navigation. The rocking of the ship, the misalignment of measuring instruments, even how tightly you hold the astrolabe. It's like trying to thread a needle on a trampoline during an earthquake. Still, you're surrounded by men who trust the stars with an almost religious fervor. They don't need to understand them, they believe in them. Some even carry star charts etched on bone or drawn with soot on their cabin walls like talismans. It's oddly comforting, like bedtime stories for the lost. On one particularly clear night, a young sailor points out a constellation you've never noticed before. That crooked one there, he says, that's the drunken sailor. Maida said if it's overhead, you're in for good luck. You don't correct him. Mostly because you don't want to ruin the magic, but also because you'd really like some good luck right now. But sometimes even the North Star isn't enough. Clouds roll in. The sky disappears. You might go days, weeks without seeing a single star. And when you do, your instruments are damp, your crew is cranky, and your charts have all smudged into a sort of grayish blob that vaguely resembles a fish. The worst part? Everyone's still pretending they know what they're doing. Ah, yes, says the helmsman, peering into the mist, just as I thought we're veering slightly southwest. Of course, says the captain, nodding solemnly. I calculated it precisely. You meanwhile are pretty sure you've been sailing in a circle. Twice. There's a kind of elegance to the chaos, though. You begin to appreciate how brave or foolish these early navigators were. They stepped onto wooden ships with no engines, no radios, no weather forecasts. Just the stars above and whatever was rattling around in their heads. Still, it's amazing they made it anywhere at all. Every successful voyage feels like it should have failed, and every failure feels heartbreakingly close to success. One explorer, Pytheas, sailed from ancient Greece up to what he thought was the end of the world, possibly Iceland using nothing but the stars, and maybe some very patient guesswork. Historians still argue whether he actually made it or just hallucinated the whole thing after eating questionable barnacles. You get the sense that most of these voyages weren't about reaching specific places, but about finding something. Spice Gold Land answers. Maybe even just peace. And for that, the stars were enough. Tonight they're back, sparkling above the Black Sea like breadcrumbs to a destination you can't quite name. You lie back on the deck, ignoring the damp wood and the stink of rope. And for a moment you believe, really believe, that if you stare long enough, the stars will tell you where to go next. They don't, of course, but they do keep twinkling. And somehow that's enough. The next morning, your captain wakes in a mood. The kind of mood where everyone walks a little faster, pretends to tie extra knots, and avoids eye contact. You hear him mutter something about dead reckoning, again only this time, with slightly more emphasis on the dead. You've probably heard the term. It sounds heroic, like something Blackbeard might shout before a cannonball rips through the mainsail. But it's really just glorified guessing. You estimate your ship's position by keeping track of how far you've traveled in a certain direction. Distance equals speed times time. Sounds simple enough. If you have an accurate clock, a consistent speed, and a map that's not drawn by someone who thinks sea serpents are a real continent, the speed part is measured using a tool called a log line. It's a rope with knots tied at intervals and a wooden plank at one end, basically the world's saddest kite. You throw the plank overboard and let the rope run out for a set amount of time measured with an hourglass. When time's up, you count the knots that have passed overboard. That's your speed in knots. Yep, that's where the term comes from. Congratulations, you now know more than half the crew. But here's the problem. The log line gets wet. The plank drags weird. The hourglass sticks. And if your hand slips while coiling the rope, the whole thing becomes a knotted disaster worthy of a sailor's most colorful vocabulary. You try it yourself and nearly fling the wooden block into the helmsman's lunch. Then there's time. Time is the cruelest joke of all. Before the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th century, accurate timekeeping at sea was impossible. Pendulum clocks hated moving ships. Sand glasses ran fast or slow depending on humidity. Water clocks, yes, those existed, were basically useless on stormy seas, unless you wanted a soggy guess. So your reckoning becomes more dead than useful after about a day. 2 if you're lucky. 3 if Neptune himself is smiling on you. You think you're 120 miles west-northwest, but in reality you're somewhere between completely lost and oops, new continent. Historians still argue whether early sailors even trusted dead reckoning, or if it was more like the maritime version of humming to yourself in a haunted house. Something to do while pretending you aren't terrified. Some explorers embraced the chaos. Magellan's circumnavigation relied on dead reckoning across vast stretches of ocean. He got there eventually. Well, his ship did. Magellan didn't. A miscalculation in the Philippines saw to that. And then there's the story of João de Nova, a Portuguese explorer who went out to find India, took one wrong left turn, and discovered Ascension Island by accident. That's kind of the story of exploration in general. You aim for one thing, miss entirely, and then name whatever you hit after your boss or your favorite saint. Preferably both. Meanwhile, your ship's cartographer is trying to keep up with the madness. He sketches lines on a map every few hours marking your estimated position with a tiny X that drifts like spilled ink. He mutters about leeway and drift and the Coriolis effect as if saying them out loud makes any of it more scientific. You ask if he's confident in the course. He looks at you with the weary smile of a man who has just drawn the same coastline 3 different ways and still doesn't know if it's real. Confidence, he says, is for land people. Still, despite the staggering margin of error, dead reckoning did sometimes work, especially when combined with celestial navigation. You'd shoot the stars at night, measure the sun's angle at noon, and adjust your guess accordingly. You'd correct for drift, adjust for current, and if you were feeling especially ambitious, try to factor in wind direction. But here's the kicker. None of it mattered if you didn't know where you started. If your port of origin was even slightly misrecorded, say, by a drunk scribe with poor handwriting, then all your calculations would be off. It's like trying to draw a straight line with a ruler that bends when you look at it sideways. You try your hand at the math, and somewhere between scribbling sine curves and approximating your current heading, using the sun and a spoon, you start to understand why so many ships vanished. It wasn't laziness or ignorance, it was hope. Hope that this time the math would hold, that the waves wouldn't push you 3 degrees too far east, that the stars would appear, that the wind would not change. By the end of the day, you've marked your position on the map 4 different times. Each mark is in a slightly different spot. You circle them all in ink, draw a smiley face in the middle, and declare it close enough. You're beginning to realize that the real miracle of exploration wasn't that people discovered new lands, but that they ever managed to find them again. As the sun dips toward the horizon, you stare out at the vast, uncaring ocean. Somewhere out there is the land. You just don't know how far, or what direction, or whether it's friendly, or even real. But hey, you've got your knots, you've got your stars, you've got your reckoning. And most of all, you've got faith. That'll do for now. You're back on deck just past dawn, rubbing sleep from your eyes as the cook passes you something that may have once been bread. The sky's pale, the sea is mercifully calm, and the map maker has spilled ink again, which frankly improves the map. This morning's topic of discussion: monsters, specifically the ones on the maps. They're hard to miss. Enormous sea serpents curling between coastlines, kraken-like tentacles emerging beside islands no one's actually seen. One map has a lion with fins. A lion in the water. What does it eat? How does it swim? Nobody knows, but someone thought it looked official. The truth is, medieval maps were part geography, part fever dream. And they weren't just works of art, they were used for navigation. Seriously. Someone risked their life using a map that warned of dragons with the same ink that marked Sicily. You lean over the chart and trace a particularly ornate creature just off the coast of what's supposed to be India. What's that, you ask? The map maker squints. That's a manticore, I think. Don't worry, it's probably symbolic. Probably. Historians still argue whether these beasts were meant literally or metaphorically. Some believe they were warnings of unknown territory. Here be lions roughly translating to, "We didn't make it this far." Others argue that sailors genuinely expected to see these creatures. Either way, the effect was the same. You approached the edge of the map with a growing sense of dread. You remember hearing about the Zeno map, drawn in the 16th century showing phantom islands like Friesland and Estadaland? Lands that never existed but still made it onto countless charts. And yet ships searched for them, sometimes for decades. They sent entire expeditions to places made up by bored cartographers or desperate sailors with blurry vision. One story goes that the fabled island of Hy-Brasil appeared on maps off the coast of Ireland for centuries. Some claim to have seen it rise from the mist glowing like gold. Others swore it vanished as they approached. Expeditions were launched. None found anything. But the island kept showing up on maps, sometimes labeled confidently, sometimes with a shy little beside it. Like even the cartographer wasn't quite sure if they were lying. You can't help but imagine the scene: a captain frustrated and sunburned, peering into the haze. There. It's right there. The crew squints. Sir. That's a cloud. Silence. Then plot the cloud. There's something tragically hilarious about it. You'd laugh harder if you weren't pretty sure your own ship is currently chasing a misidentified weather pattern. Even so-called accurate maps were often full of errors. Coastlines stretched like taffy. Mountains appeared where none existed. Rivers flowed the wrong way. The sheer inconsistency made your job as a navigator feel more like solving a riddle than following directions. You recall the infamous Vinland map, allegedly showing parts of North America before Columbus. Some hailed it as revolutionary. Others called it a fraud. To this day, historians argue about its authenticity, though the ink analysis isn't looking good. But it's not all gloom and fantasy. Some maps were genuinely helpful. The portolan charts, for example, drawn as early as the 13th century, offered startlingly accurate coastlines and sailing directions, at least for the Mediterranean. They were based on real observations, careful compass bearings, and most importantly, didn't include unicorns. Unfortunately, the further you got from Europe, the fuzzier things became. Parts of Africa were labeled terra incognita, unknown land. Entire sections of Asia were just blank spaces with ominous notations like here dwell giants or land of fire. Inspiring. One of your crewmates finds an old map tucked in a leather case sealed with wax. He unfolds it slowly, reverently. Its beautiful gold leaf rich blues, elegant script. Also, it shows California as an island. Japan floating somewhere near Mexico and Australia as a giant smudge labeled unknown southern land. You all nod. Seems legit. Of course you can't ignore the political motives either. Map making wasn't just about accuracy, it was about control. Empires exaggerated their territories, shrunk their rivals, and sometimes just made up places altogether. You see one map where the King of Portugal has conveniently claimed an entire ocean. Ambitious. Cartographers were artists, explorers, and propagandists rolled into one. Some traveled with fleets. Others sat safely at desks, drawing from reports that had passed through 5 interpreters and 3 drunk sailors. Yet the maps they produced shaped how people saw the world sometimes for centuries. You realize how much power a map holds. It's not just a guide, it's a statement of belief. That this place exists, that it matters, that we own it. Even if nobody's ever set foot there, even if it's a myth. You think about all the men who sailed into nothingness chasing the lines drawn on these old scrolls. Some never came back. Others returned years later, bearded and bewildered, swearing they found something. And maybe they did. Or maybe they just couldn't admit they'd gotten lost. Tonight you lie in your bunk, the flickering lantern light casting shadows on a map pinned to the wall. The sea dragons look less menacing now, almost friendly. The landmasses wobble like melting cheese. You trace your route with a finger knowing full well it's wrong, but it's the best you've got. And somewhere out there beyond the ink and parchment and centuries of mistaken guesses land does exist. You just have to keep sailing. Maybe you'll find it. Maybe you won't. But at least your map has character. You're starting to get the hang of latitude. Kind of. At least when the sun cooperates and you're not too seasick to hold the astrolabe steady. Measuring how far north or south you are. Not so bad. You check the angle of the sun at high noon, do a little math, and you've got a number. Might even be accurate within a few miles. Not perfect, but livable. Then comes longitude. And that friend is where everything unravels. Longitude. The east-west coordinate that tells you how far around the globe you are sounds easy. Just measure how far you've traveled from some fixed line like the prime meridian, except how do you measure that on a rocking ship with no landmarks? Here's the theory. You compare the local time on the ship to the time at your point of departure. Every hour of difference equals 15 degrees of longitude. Easy, right? So, if you know it's noon where you are and it's 3 p.m. in Greenwich, you must be 45 degrees west. Simple math. Except that only works if you have a clock that keeps perfect time across weak storms, salt air, and daily insult. Which you absolutely do not. Your sand glass is moody. Your water clock leaked during that squall last Tuesday. And your best pocket sundial only works when you're standing still on land, without wind, and the sun is in a good mood. So yes, you're out of luck. This was the problem that haunted sailors for centuries. Historians still argue whether some early navigators truly understood how vital longitude was, or whether they just accepted mostly west as a way of life. Even skilled captains could be hundreds of miles off course without realizing it, until they smacked into something unexpected like a reef or Florida. One notorious example, the silly naval disaster of 1707. Admiral Sir Cloudsley Shovel, a name that sounds like he should be in a Dickens novel, misjudged his fleet's longitude and crashed into the Isles of Scilly off England's coast. 4 warships lost. Over 400 men drowned. It was one of the worst navigational disasters in British history, and it all came down to not knowing where exactly they were on the map. After that, people started taking longitude very seriously. There were even rewards. In 1714, the British Parliament offered the longitude prize £20,000 millions today to anyone who could solve the longitude problem. The best minds tried. Some turned to the stars, others to the moon. One popular method was lunar distance. The idea you measure the angle between the moon and a star, compare it to tables of lunar motion, and calculate the time at a known location. It's basically trying to do algebra on a trampoline with your eyes half closed. It required absurd precision, stable skies, and the kind of mathematical focus that's hard to maintain when you haven't bathed in weeks. And still some did it. Neville Maskelyne, the Astronomer Royal, published detailed tables. French and Dutch sailors attempted lunar calculations with varying degrees of success, but most captains hated it. The math was tedious. The tables were heavy. The moon moved too fast. Let's just aim west became a recurring strategy. Enter John Harrison, a self-educated clockmaker with the persistence of a barnacle and the patience of a saint. He built a series of marine chronometers clocks that could keep accurate time at sea without pendulums or water or general misery. His fourth version, the H4, finally cracked the code. It was accurate enough to calculate longitude within half a degree. That was revolutionary. And also very, very late in the game, before Harrison guesswork was standard. One ship's log from a Spanish galleon records the captain making 12 longitude calculations in a single day, and arriving at 12 different answers. He chose the one that felt most correct. You wish that was a joke. Your own attempts at longitude aren't much better. You try timing the sun's arc using a watch you know is already off by several minutes. Then you compare it to a lunar chart smudged with old stew. The result is a location somewhere between the Azores and absolute denial. Even seasoned navigators struggled. Some compensated with experience knowing the usual currents and winds. Others leaned into it, naming islands after the mistakes that brought them there. Mistaken Point, False Cape, Oops Bay. Okay, that last one's not real, but it should be. The irony is once you've been somewhere, it's relatively easy to find it again, assuming you wrote down the right numbers. But the first time that was a roll of celestial dice. You find an old chart tucked in a barrel scribbled in with guesses notes, even complaints. Suspect land here. Might be rock, might be sea cow. Another corner says longitude unknown. Just hope. You tuck it into your coat pocket like a treasure map. And yet despite all the frustration, longitude had to be pursued. Trade depended on it. War demanded it. Empires rose and fell based on whose ships could get to the right coastline at the right time without accidentally discovering Greenland again. You sit under the stars one night, squinting through your sextant wishing the moon would hold still for just 1 second. You try to calculate your position. You fail, laugh, and write a very optimistic number in the logbook. Because honestly, when you're lost at sea, a confident mistake beats no number at all. The compass is supposed to be your friend. It sits in its little box like a smug oracle needle, twitching, always pointing more or less north. Except when it doesn't. Which is unfortunately a lot more often than you'd like. You stare at it now, watching the needle wag slightly like it's trying to make up its mind. North is that way, or maybe over there. Hard to say. Because here's the dirty little secret of early exploration: compasses weren't always helpful. In fact, sometimes they were deeply, unapologetically wrong. Magnetic north isn't the same as true north. You learn that quickly. The Earth's magnetic field is weird. It shifts. It drifts. It even flips, though, not on any schedule you need to panic about. Probably. The difference between magnetic north and true north is called magnetic declination. It varies depending on where you are. Which is a fun twist because to correct for it, you need to know where you are in the first place. Historians still argue whether early sailors knew about magnetic declination or just assumed their compass was in a bad mood. Some Chinese navigators noted the difference as early as the 11th century. Others blissfully unaware. Until, of course, they crashed into the wrong continent and blamed the stars. You ask the ship's quartermaster if he's adjusted for declination today. He just squints, shrugs, and says, "Feels lucky." That's not science. That's gambling with extra steps. Back in port, everyone swore by the compass. Reliable in any storm, they said. But out here in the damp, creaky middle of nowhere, you learn the truth. The compass is only as useful as your willingness to distrust it just enough. A gentle paranoia, if you will. There's also the issue of interference. A lot of these old ships have nails and tools and cannons, giant hunks of iron all over the place. And what does a compass love more than a nearby magnetic object? Nothing. It dances toward iron like a moth to a forge. One afternoon, a sailor decides to clean his cutlass next to the compass station. Within minutes, your heading is 12 degrees off. No one notices until you pass the same angry-looking wave pattern twice. You swear the ocean is mocking you. Another time, someone sets a bucket of nails on the chart table. For safekeeping, he says. The compass needle starts spinning like it's possessed. You remove the nails, it stops. You return the nails. It spins again. You remove the sailor. Problem solved. You try relocating the compass only to discover your new position is equally cursed. Turns out the whole ship is basically a floating magnet. Then there's the compass rose. Those ornate, beautiful flourishes on the charts, mostly decorative, they point in vague directions and are often colored so prettily that people forget they need to be accurate. You get one chart with north labeled Septentrio East as Orions and a suspiciously large sea monster where south should be. Very helpful. One of the more tragicomic tales you hear is about the doomed English expedition of Sir Hugh Willoughby. In 1553, he set out to find a northeast passage to Asia. Unfortunately, his compasses were reportedly affected by strange magnetic anomalies. He ended up hopelessly off course, stuck in ice, and well, let's just say, the mission didn't end with tea and medals. You laugh about it now. But deep down you feel the quiet terror of it. The idea that your one reliable tool, the thing pointing you forward, might not just be unreliable, but actively misleading. Like asking a cat for directions. And yet compasses had their moments. They helped in fog. They steadied hands during storms. When the stars were gone and the sun was hiding, the compass was all you had. You'd cradle it in your palms, whisper encouragement, and hope it wasn't having one of those days. One cloudy evening, the captain orders a new heading. Due northwest, he says. You check the compass, it agrees. Or maybe it's just being polite. You chart the course, steer into the gloom, and hope for the best. Hours pass. You feel the wind shift the swell tilt differently beneath the hull. Something's off. The captain consults the compass again. It's now insisting you're going east. You haven't turned. No one has. But the compass is sure of it. It takes a while before someone notices a musket stored too close to the navigation table. You move it. The needle rights itself. The captain doesn't speak for a full minute. There's an odd sense of intimacy that grows between you and the compass. You learn its quirks. You whisper to it. You ask it questions like it's a small magnetic deity. Is this the right way, you murmur? Blink once for yes. It never blinks. But sometimes even a lying compass leads you somewhere. Eventually your ship rounds a cape you didn't expect. You check the charts, frown at the needle, and realize you're not where you meant to be, but you're somewhere. The stars are hidden. The waves don't care. The wind's shifting again. You glance at the compass one more time. It twitches, and you sail on. Because sometimes in the middle of all the iron and chaos, even a flawed needle still points mostly in the right direction. The wind is in your favor, for now. You lean over the rail, watching the waves roll under the hull in steady rhythm. The sky is pale cloud-filtered. The sails are full. It feels briefly like the ship knows what it's doing. Like maybe you're heading the right way. Then a sudden gust shifts direction. The sails lurch. The rigging groans. And just like that, the ocean reminds you you're not in control. Weather. It's always been the hidden boss fight of navigation. It changes on a whim, it ignores your prayers, and worst of all, it hides the stars. And when the stars vanish, so does your last reliable sense of direction. This is how explorers get lost, not because they're fools, but because the sky turns gray for 5 days in a row, and suddenly nothing works. Your compass starts acting strange. The waves don't look familiar. The crew stops joking. Even the seabirds give you suspicious glances like they know you're bluffing. Historians still argue whether early explorers had any real way to compensate for extended cloudy periods. Some had backup methods, reading swell directions, tracking the sun through layers of cloud, or using wind patterns, but these were inconsistent at best. You could feel like you were heading west, only to discover days later you've been drifting in a lazy curve toward absolutely nowhere. One navigator you admire, a Portuguese sailor named Duarte Pacheco Pereira, wrote long, desperate notes about trying to navigate in overcast conditions. He described the sea as a confounding mirror and referred to the sun as that traitorous clock. Relatable. You begin to appreciate how wind and current don't just help or hinder, they decide. Your sails may be full, but if they're full in the wrong direction, congratulations, you're going fast. Toward a mistake. Take the Gulf Stream, for example. Early explorers didn't understand it fully, but they noticed. Sail west and it might help you along. Try to sail back east through it, though, and suddenly you're crawling at the speed of regret. The Pacific, too, is home to sneaky currents like the North Equatorial Current that happily drag ships hundreds of miles off course. You don't see it, you don't feel it, but you wake up one morning and realize that island you were aiming for is now a fading memory and a dot on someone else's map. Clouds roll in again tonight. Not the dramatic thunderheads of storms, just a slow, creeping grayness that swallows the sky in layers. No sun, no stars. You try to read the waves, but they all look the same, long, slow, indifferent. The captain doesn't hide his worry. He paces, he taps the rail, he fiddles with a soggy quadrant. You recognize the look, it's the same one you saw 2 weeks ago when you ran out of pickled onions. Pure, helpless frustration. In desperation, the crew turns to other signs. You hear someone mention bioluminescent plankton, claiming they glow differently depending on the direction of travel. This is scientifically speaking nonsense, but no one's correcting him. You try to smile. It comes out as a grimace. Then there's the birds. You've noticed them: petrels, shearwaters, gulls darting through the wind. Some sailors swear you can tell your proximity to land by their flight patterns. You're not sure. But when a flock starts heading southeast at dawn, a few crew members whisper and adjust the sails slightly in that direction. Can't hurt, one mutters. Unless they're flying home to drown in other ads. By day 4 of overcast skies, the morale dips. Everything smells damp. The bread is soft in ways it should not be. Someone plays a bone flute below deck, slow, mournful notes that echo like a warning from a distant lighthouse you'll never reach. One morning you spot flotsam driftwood bobbing in the water. You lean over and haul up a piece. It's smooth, sun-bleached, and has barnacles clinging to one end. The captain takes it, sniffs it like it might offer coordinates, then tosses it overboard again. Could be from land, could be from another lost ship. You begin to understand how explorers clung to the smallest clues. A change in water color, a warm breeze, a different smell on the air. Were these signs of land or just tricks of a sea that loved to tease? Historians sometimes debate how much early navigators truly understood about wind and current patterns. Some argue they mastered seasonal routes like the Indian Ocean monsoons far earlier than we give them credit for. Others believe many stumbled into those patterns only recognizing them after the fact, when they made it home and lived long enough to make a second voyage. The truth probably lies in between. Trial, error, survival. You learn quickly when your life depends on it, but even the most skilled sailors made mistakes, and when the clouds refused to break, even the best were left adrift. You stare up into the blank, unyielding sky. Somewhere beyond that curtain is Polaris, the sun, a dozen navigation options. But for now, all you have is a vague breeze and a lot of hoping. You learn to listen to the ship itself, the way it hums, the way it leans into a current, or strains against an unseen force. The creeks become familiar, almost comforting. You know the difference between just wind and turn the sails now. Still, there's no getting around it. When you lose sight of the stars, you lose a little piece of your soul. Not just because you're directionless, but because they were your company. They told you where you were, who you were, that the world still had structure. And now it's just water and cloud and slow doubt. You wrap a cloak tighter around your shoulders, listen to the distant flap of canvas, and close your eyes. Maybe tomorrow the sky will open again. Maybe the stars will come back. Or maybe you'll keep sailing forward blind but determined. Sometimes that's enough. You're losing track of time. Not in the metaphysical sense, though, that too, but in the very practical, unsettling way where you're not quite sure what day it is. The sun hasn't come out in 2, maybe 3 rotations, and the hourglasses all seem to be lying. You flip one weight check it, and it still hasn't moved. Or maybe it's gone too fast. Either way, you sigh and mark the logbook with a hopeful guess. Time, as it turns out, is just as slippery at sea as direction. You start the day thinking it's Tuesday. The captain says Wednesday. The cook insists it's Friday because the bread is especially moldy. You go with Friday. You want the bread to have a reason. Long before wristwatches and synchronized clocks, sailors kept time in intervals bells rung every half hour during a 4-hour watch. 8 bells meant the end of a shift, not necessarily noon or midnight. You lived your life in cycles of bells and watches, not calendar dates. And that's assuming the guy ringing the bell wasn't asleep drunk or distracted by a flying fish. One deckhand swears we've skipped a whole day. I'm telling you, yesterday was 2 days ago, he insists. No one corrects him. Mostly because no one can. You'd think celestial navigation would fix this. Just observe the sun. Right noon is when the sun's at its highest point. But at sea, the horizon isn't flat. It wobbles. The air distorts light. Your instruments are damp and your eye muscles are tired. You find yourself holding your breath just to steady your hand. Still noon, observations were vital. Without accurate clocks, this was how you figured out when now was. The trouble is, longitude depends on knowing time precisely down to the minute. A mistake of even 4 minutes means you're off by a full degree of longitude. That's roughly 60 nautical miles. So if your timekeeping is even slightly off, you're practically charting fantasy novels. Historians still argue whether sailors truly understood the limitations of their timekeeping methods, or whether they simply accepted a margin of error the size of Madagascar. Some captains may have relied more on instinct than science, trusting the smell of salt or the shape of waves more than any hourglass. Then came the great revolution in seafaring time, the marine chronometer. We've mentioned it before, John Harrison's obsessive masterpiece, but here's where it matters. With a chronometer, you could carry the exact time from a known location, like Greenwich across the sea. Every day at local noon, you compared the sun's position to that home time. The difference told you your longitude. Suddenly, you weren't just guessing, you were calculating. And it worked. But you don't have a chronometer. Not yet. You're part of the awkward middle generation stuck between crude hourglasses and precision instruments scribbling notes into the wind, and hoping you're less wrong today than yesterday. One afternoon in a break between squalls, you try using the sun to tell the time. You hold a sextant steady barely and take a reading. You compare it to a table so waterlogged, it smells like soup. You mark your place. The captain nods grimly. Close enough. Later you realize the sextant's mirror was slightly off. Your mark is wrong, by a lot. You erase it from the logbook and draw a seagull instead. Still, it wasn't all confusion. Sailors used other cues, small rituals to keep their sanity. Some set the ship's bell to the rising of specific stars. Others built sundials on the deck comically inaccurate when the ship tilted, but comforting all the same. The Polynesians' master navigators without clocks or charts used rhythms of waves, flights of birds, and oral knowledge passed down through generations. Their timing came not from measuring, but from knowing. You envy that. Your timing feels like fumbling for a light switch in a thunderstorm. At night, you lie awake and listen to the creak of the timbers, the rhythm of footsteps above the soft splash of waves against the hull. These sounds become your metronome. You don't know the exact hour, but you feel its weight. The midpoint between watches. The lull before dawn. You wonder if time ever really mattered at sea. Not in the way it does on land with appointments and alarms and trains that supposedly run on schedules. Out here, time stretches folds and reshapes itself. A calm hour feels like a day. A stormy minute lasts forever. One story makes the rounds over supper about a ship that lost track of time entirely and arrived at port 4 days before it was expected. Or maybe 4 days late. The records disagree, the cook shrugs. Either way, they survived. You raise a biscuit and toast. Survival is enough. You flip through the ship's log and notice that past entries all start the same weather fare. Spirits low. Bearings uncertain. You laugh. It feels like poetry. Tragic poetry maybe, but still. One day the sun finally returns. It slices through the clouds with the kind of triumphant glow that makes you want to write a hymn. The crew rushes to instruments. Sextants gleam, shadows stretch. And for the first time in days, you can measure anything with confidence. You mark the noon line, compare it to your best estimate of Greenwich time, and calculate your position. It's not perfect, but it's close enough to recognize where you're going, and that after all this drifting feels like a miracle. That night, you watch the stars rise one by one, each one ticking into place like a celestial watch. Time at last feels like it's ticking again. Maybe not perfectly, but clearly, quietly, comfortingly. And for now, that's enough. Land is supposed to smell like something. That's what the old hands say, a change in the air, a warmth, even a sweetness. But this morning, the only thing in your nose is salt, and the scent of your own shirt, which is frankly losing the battle against mildew. Still, you squint at the horizon. Just maybe? Nope, just more ocean. And that's the problem, isn't it? When explorers did find land, it was usually not the land they expected. Even with stars charts and that temperamental compass, they could, and often did, get it utterly hilariously wrong. Take Christopher Columbus. He was looking for a new route to Asia. What he found were the Bahamas, and then he named islands after Spanish monarchs, Christian saints, and occasionally things that just sounded neat. All the while insisting loudly and repeatedly that this was India. Historians still argue whether he truly believed it, or if he was just too stubborn to admit otherwise. You can almost imagine him mumbling, "That's definitely Asia," as parrots screech overhead and unfamiliar trees wave hello. Misidentification was practically a job requirement in the age of discovery. You hear about one Spanish expedition that landed in Florida and assumed they were in China. Another crew explored Newfoundland while claiming it was part of Cathay. It's like trying to use a coffee-stained restaurant menu to find your way across town, and then confidently telling everyone you've reached Paris. Sometimes the confusion was cartographic. If your maps were off, which they usually were, and your tools were off, which they also usually were, then congratulations, you might just rename an entire continent. The best part, once you drew it on your map, no one could really argue. Are you sure this isn't India? Well, no, but now it says India right here in lovely calligraphy. You lean over today's map, freshly copied from the ship's log. It has the usual blend of real and hopeful features: a small island that might be a shadow, a bay that might be an optical illusion, a coastline that's 70% speculation, 20% coffee stains, and 10% ambition. It's not that early sailors were incompetent. Far from it. They were just playing a game with bad rules, incomplete instructions, and a board that changed shape when no one was looking. Take the case of Terra Australis. It was a massive landmass that appeared on maps for centuries, based on the idea that there must be a southern continent to balance the northern ones. Logical, in a way, but also completely wrong, at least in terms of where people thought it was. Ships searched in vain for this mysterious southern land, often ending up cold, wet, and very lost. Some captains invented islands just to cover mistakes. Ah yes, we meant to stop here. This is St. Brendan's Isle. Never mind that no one could find it again, it was now a place. Because maps said so. Truth bent to ink. You think about how power shaped naming. Explorers weren't just lost tourists, they were agents of empires. When they discovered something, it wasn't just a pin in the map. It was a claim. Naming became an act of ownership even if the land already had people, cultures, and names of its own. You find this unsettling. Understandable, but unsettling. One crewmate tells the story of a Dutch ship that found an island, stayed for 3 days, then sailed off calling it New Amsterdam. A week later, another ship showed up and named it Port Hope. For the next 60 years, maps alternated between the two names. Today, it's a bird sanctuary. Mistakes layered upon mistakes. Sometimes literal. Like the phantom island of Sandy Island, which showed up on Google Maps well into the 21st century, despite no one ever actually seeing it in person. It took a modern ship to sail directly over the location and confirm there's absolutely nothing there. You start to think that being wrong is kind of the default state of exploration. And that's not a criticism. It's a strange kind of bravery. To step into the unknown, get it totally wrong, and still keep going. Because sometimes being wrong leads to something better. Take the Portuguese navigator Diogo Cano. He was looking for a route to India and instead became the first European to reach the Congo River. Wrong, absolutely. Important, hugely. Or look at Abel Tasman. He missed mainland Australia entirely but gave his name to Tasmania. You don't get a whole island named after you by being right, you get it by showing up. Even now, as your ship drifts slightly south of your intended heading, you spot something on the horizon. A smudge? A blur? A maybe? The lookout yells something unintelligible and the crew stirs. You grab the spyglass. It's land, maybe. You check the charts? Nothing is marked there? You check yesterday's log. You should be farther west, or maybe east. You're not sure anymore. But the captain shrugs and nods. Let's go see. And just like that, you're making history again, albeit vaguely. You don't know what you found. It might be a real island. It might be a trick of light. It might be a place no one else has ever charted, or one 100 others have found and forgotten. Either way, when you step ashore tomorrow, you'll have a choice. You can name it something bold, something proud, or maybe something honest like We Have No Idea Island. But whatever name you choose, it'll go on the map. Wrong, right, or gloriously in between. You've dropped anchor near the Maybe Island. It's small, unassuming, and mostly made of rocks and scrubby bushes that look mildly judgmental. Still it's land. Solid ground. A break from the shifting, endless sea. You step onto it with a wobble, your legs recalibrating to this new, unmoving reality. It feels like walking on someone else's porch without an invitation. The crew spreads out. A few poke around for coconuts or anything edible. One sailor immediately claims a flat boulder as his command seat and sits like a king with sunburn. Another begins digging a hole for reasons no one fully understands. Your job, make notes. Record the latitude, sketch the shoreline, estimate its size, and give it a name. Because if you name it, it's yours. That's the rule. Even if it's already part of another culture's world. Even if it's just a rock with ambition. You begin to measure. The tools aren't elegant. A length of rope for distance. A stick and shadow to find due noon. A quadrant to take latitude. You get numbers, but they feel vague, like they're embarrassed to be so uncertain. Still, you write them down. Naming is next. The captain suggests Port Providence. Someone else offers New Hope. You offer definitely not India, but that gets overruled. Historians still argue about naming rights and exploration. Who really had the authority to claim land? The first person to see it. The first to step ashore. The one with the fanciest flag. In practice, it was usually whoever had the loudest voice and the best handwriting. Empires were drawn with ink, not consent. You walk the perimeter of the Maybe Island. It takes less than half an hour. There's no fresh water, no animals, just birds, lots of birds. One of them stares at you too long and you feel vaguely judged. Still, there's a thrill in discovery, even if it's not quite yours. You imagine what ancient Polynesian navigators must have felt, arriving at distant specks of land in the vast Pacific, guided only by wave patterns, stars, and ancestral knowledge. Their navigation was holistic, more art than math. They felt their way across oceans, reading the language of the sea with a fluency few today could match. You just followed a misaligned compass and a vague sense of left. But you're here. That night, the crew builds a small fire roast. Something vaguely fish-like and tells stories. One sailor swears this island is cursed. Another says it looks like a turtle and should be named accordingly. The mood is good. Being lost feels almost like an adventure again. Then someone pulls out the map. It's the most recent chart, crisp, almost smug in its inaccuracies. You all peer at the region where you currently are. There's nothing marked. Just open sea. The captain draws a tiny shape in the margin, then writes in careful script, "Island sighted." Likely uncharted. Claimed by HMS Providence, third day of the moon. Just like that, the Maybe Island becomes something real. A name on paper, a place in the world. Whether it stays that way is another story. You've heard of dozens of these little islands named logged and then forgotten. Some were real but got erased in later maps when no one else found them again. Others were illusions, cloud shadows, mirages, floating debris mistaken for land. One infamous case involved a massive iceberg that got mapped, named, and even visited before it melted, and was quietly removed from future charts. Even now, modern satellite mapping finds phantom islands that shouldn't exist, and fails to locate others that were clearly marked in centuries past. The ocean plays tricks, and people make mistakes. You think of all the sailors who placed their hope in a speck of land that wasn't really there, who changed course based on rumor, who sailed for months chasing the idea of a place only to find nothing, or worse, to find something and realize it wasn't what they hoped. You look at the stars that night from the edge of the island. They're bright again, mercifully. You recognize Orion's belt, the Southern Cross, Polaris dim on the horizon behind you. They make more sense than any map, and yet the stars don't tell you what the place is called. That's a human thing. Names are how we pretend we understand. This is New Terra. This is Cape Despair. This is Turtle Rock. You smile, but you wonder who gave up on the old names. The ones used by the people who may have been here long before you. The ones that meant something before the charts got redrawn. Historians still argue how many new discoveries were actually rediscoveries, places known to indigenous peoples marked by oral histories, stories, carvings. Names that never made it onto European scrolls but were no less real. Your map doesn't show those. You feel that quiet unease again. The one that comes from realizing your discoveries are only discoveries because someone else's story was erased. Still morning comes, and with it the decision to leave. The island has been noted, drawn, claimed. Time to move on. You watch it fade behind you, slowly swallowed by haze. It looks smaller now, less important, but it's still there somewhere on your map. And maybe someday someone else will find it. Maybe they'll call it something different. Maybe they'll correct your coordinates, redraw its shape, learn its real name. But for now you found it. And that's enough. You're back at sea. The maybe island is behind you, shrinking into a memory and a marginal sketch. Ahead is, well, more the same. A vast, undulating quilt of waves and weather and invisible lines. You're sailing blind again, even though the sky is clear. The trouble now isn't knowing where you are. It's knowing what that means. You've charted a place. You've recorded your position roughly, but how do you make sense of the space between here and there? Early explorers faced this constantly, the dilemma of not just where they stood, but how far they'd come, and what that journey meant. Measuring distance at sea is by default deeply suspicious. You try to track it by speed. But how do you measure speed when your vessel is subject to wind current and the occasional minor existential crisis? The answer historically was the log line. It's beautifully simple. A wooden board shaped like a slice of pie tied to a rope knotted at regular intervals. You toss the board off the stern, it drags behind the ship, and you count how many knots pass through your hand in a set amount of time, typically 30 seconds measured by a sand glass. Hence the term knots as a unit of speed. You literally count them. You're timing wood on a string in water. It's like a seafaring fidget toy that also measures velocity. Historians still argue how accurate this method ever truly was. Factors like drag waves and enthusiastic rope pullers could throw off the count. But for centuries it was the standard. Whole voyages were built on guessing how far a ship had gone based on how many knots slipped through calloused fingers at sunset. You try it now. The water is calm, the sandglass is flipped, the rope hisses past your hand. 6 knots, someone calls. Not bad. You log it, feeling briefly like part of a long, slow-moving algorithm powered entirely by salt and hope. But speed is only one piece. You also need direction, and over days you need to estimate your position based on both. This method, noble in theory and chaotic in practice, is called dead reckoning. That's not dead as in deceased, by the way. It's a corruption of deduced. You're deducing your position. You begin at a known point and calculate your current position based on speed, heading time, and drift. If it sounds suspiciously imprecise, congratulations, you're catching on. It's like saying, well, we left that island going northwest at 6 knots for 3 days, give or take. So we must be here. And then you circle a place on the chart with the confidence of someone ordering at a restaurant they've never been to. Dead reckoning is charmingly optimistic. It assumes the ship always moves as expected, that winds are steady, that currents are negligible. It's like guessing your location in a mall based solely on how fast you think you've been walking since the food court. You learn that many explorers combined this method with celestial readings when they could get them to update and correct their assumed position. But even that wasn't foolproof. Clouds roll in. The sextant gets dropped. The sand glass breaks. Suddenly, your reckoning is deader than expected. Some famous navigators became obsessed with correcting these errors. Captain James Cook, for example, was a master of combining observations, lunar distances, and meticulous record-keeping to improve his charts. He was methodical, disciplined, and still occasionally off by hundreds of miles. You don't feel quite as precise. Today, your logbook looks like a child's sketchbook. The wind keeps shifting. The current is stronger than expected. You pass a clump of seaweed that definitely wasn't on yesterday's course. And the stars. They're mocking you with how little help they seem to offer. One evening after dinner, if we're being generous with that term, you decide to double-check the log line. You toss it out again. This time, only 4 knots pass through. Either the ship has slowed or the person holding the rope is distracted. Both are likely. You scribble a correction into the margin speed, possibly incorrect. Morale also variable. That seems honest. Dead reckoning, you realize, isn't just about position. It's a mental map. A way of organizing uncertainty into something resembling confidence. You keep updating it because otherwise you'd be forced to admit that you have no idea where you are. It's funny. On land, you can point to a tree, a mountain, a building. You can orient yourself. But on the open sea, there's no such luxury. It's all motion and memory. Your journey is held together by guesswork and tradition and salt-stiff charts. Still, you feel a strange fondness for it. Dead reckoning is honest. It admits the chaos, it accepts imperfection. It says, this is where I think I am, until proven otherwise. And it gives you a kind of faith, not in your tools necessarily, but in the process. The constant correction, the adjustments, the ability to steer by your own accumulated errors. You look at the map. You compare the last few entries. You draw a line forward. It bends slightly, curves around an unknown, and lands somewhere. You nod. That's close enough. Later that night, you wake to the sound of wind shifting. The sails groan. You hear feet pounding on the deck above. A squall, a storm. No just one doing its usual nonsense. Still, the heading must be adjusted. You climb groggily to the deck, grab the compass, which is behaving today, and tweak your path. Just a little. You note it in the log. One more update to the reckoning. One more piece of the puzzle, even if the final picture is still blurry. You've been wrong before. You'll be wrong again. But at least now you're wrong systematically. And that's the closest thing to navigation some explorers ever had. The ocean is quieter today. Too quiet. The kind of stillness that makes you uneasy, not because it's dangerous, but because it's unfamiliar. You've grown used to noise, the creak of rigging, the slap of sails, the distant shout of a frustrated crew member failing to tie a knot correctly. Now it's just the hush of a sea so calm it feels staged. It gives you time to think. You sit near the helm, chewing on a piece of dried fruit that might once have been a plum. You flip through the logbook, running your fingers along entries filled with coordinates, wind notations, and desperate underlines. You realize something strange even with all your tools. All your stars and maps. What you've really been doing is guessing with style. That's not a bad thing. It's just the nature of exploration. But it does bring up one uncomfortable question, the kind many early navigators avoided until it was too late. What if the world is not shaped how you think it is? That question haunted explorers. Because even if you knew where you were, how could you be sure of what lay beyond? Or even what shape you were standing on? Historians still argue whether the average sailor in the 15th century truly believed the world was round. The educated elite did thanks to the ancient Greeks who'd worked it out centuries earlier. Eratosthenes had even measured Earth's circumference using shadows and sticks. Clever guy. But what about the average crewman? The guy tying knots, dodging buckets, and praying for wind. He might have believed in sea monsters, edge-of-the-world waterfalls, or floating islands tethered to the sky by invisible chains. You once asked a deckmate what he thought lay past the western horizon. He squinted and said, "Hopefully something that doesn't want to eat us." Fair enough. But even among scholars, the world map was messy. Look at the famous TO maps, medieval diagrams, that showed the world as a circle divided by a T with Jerusalem in the center. Symbolic? Yes. Accurate? Not even close. Later came the Portolan charts, more practical, filled with detailed coastlines and windrose lines. Beautiful to look at. Wildly inaccurate once you moved inland. You could sail a perfect line along the coast of the Mediterranean, only to find that the land 2 miles inland was labeled, "Here be lions." Still, these maps were precious. They represented someone's best attempt to understand the world, and often they were passed from hand to hand, copied imperfectly, smudged by fingers, altered by wishful thinking. One famous example, the Waldseemüller map of 1507, the first to use the name America. It labeled the New World as separate from Asia, based largely on letters from Amerigo Vespucci, who maybe possibly realized South America wasn't just an extension of Asia. It was bold, it was speculative, and it stuck. That's how the world gets drawn. Not with certainty, but with confidence. You look at your own chart now. It's stained, wrinkled, and crowded with scribbled corrections. There are phantom islands, exaggerated capes, and question marks, next to at least 3 probably land notations. One of those was a cloud. Another was a whale. The third, no one remembers. But you leave them on the map. Not because they're accurate, but because they tell the story. They say someone was here trying to make sense of chaos. There's a quiet dignity in that. And then there's the lies. Because, let's be honest, not every mapmaker was innocent. Some altered coastlines intentionally to confuse rivals. Some added fictional islands to prove who was copying whom. You might have heard of trap streets in modern maps, fake roads included to catch plagiarists. The concept existed even in early navigation. If your competitor's map also showed Captain Daryl's floating rock well, now you know who's been cheating. One sailor tells you about High Brazil, a mythical island west of Ireland that appeared on maps for centuries. It would vanish and reappear. Some swore they'd seen it on the horizon. Others chased it for weeks. No one ever landed on it. But it stayed on the charts. Why? Because maybe. Because what if? Because maps weren't just guides, they were hopes. You remember that every time you look at your own. It's not perfect. It's probably not even close. But it's yours. You update it again today, tweaking your last dead reckoning point. You sketch a new shoal where the water changed color. You cross out a cape that turned out to be a cloud. You feel a strange mix of humility and pride. You don't know the world, but you're participating in its discovery. Even your mistakes are part of the process. And that's how it's always been. Exploration was never about certainties. It was about trying anyway. Stepping off the edge of what you think you understand, and sketching what you find wrongly, creatively, optimistically. Sometimes you find a new land. Sometimes you find a whale and mislabel it floating continent. And sometimes, just sometimes, you find out that the map is not the territory and the world is far bigger, messier, and more beautiful than you ever imagined. You're not lost. Well, not exactly. You're just not precisely where you expected to be, and the place you thought you'd find, by now, is conspicuously absent. There's a thin line between navigational uncertainty and full-blown maritime embarrassment. And you currently are walking it with the poise of a man trying to sneak off a dance floor mid-waltz. You scan the horizon. No land. No ships. No birds. Just a wide ocean that continues to say in its passive-aggressive way, "You sure about this, Captain? The charts say you should have passed a small chain of islands by now. The compass says you're still heading west. The stars, when they appear, say you're close. But your gut says you're not even in the right ocean. This is where it gets philosophical. What is being lost, really? Is it not knowing your location or not recognizing what you're seeing? Maybe it's when your map and your eyes have stopped agreeing and are no longer on speaking terms. Historians still argue about how many early explorers truly got lost versus how many just adjusted expectations mid-journey. Magellan, for instance, set out to find a western route to the Spice Islands. He ended up sailing through a strait that now bears his name, crossing the largest ocean on Earth and dying in the Philippines. Was that lost? Or was it just aggressively optimistic rebranding? You think about that as you reread the notes in your own logbook, observed island on horizon? Possibly misidentified? Possibly. Or maybe you stared at a cloud for 30 minutes, while the crew placed bets on your sanity. It's not just geography either. Being lost messes with morale. The mood aboard shifts. The laughter fades, meals get quieter. You hear more muttering. People avoid the maps like they're cursed scrolls. One deckhand begins carving a tiny raft out of driftwood. Another starts keeping his own secret journal. You find pages from it later. It reads, "Captain still believes in the existence of the Western Isles. I believe in salted pork." One of us will be right. There's also superstition. A sailor tells you about the latitude ghost, a spirit that appears to ships when they cross the same invisible line too many times. He whispers that your ship may be haunted not by ghosts, but by indecision. And honestly, he might be right. Because this isn't just about physical location anymore. It's psychological. A creeping awareness that you might be out of your depth. So you return to the basics, you take measurements, you plot positions, you consult every map. You try celestial fixes even though the clouds roll in just in time to ruin each attempt. You throw out the log line, it tangles. You try dead reckoning, you cross-reference with the estimated drift. You calculate leeway, you curse quietly. Still nothing makes sense. So you stop. You sit on the quarterdeck one evening, sip tepid water from a cup that smells faintly of onions and accept the truth. You're off course, maybe far off course, and maybe that's okay. Because here's the secret, everyone got lost. Columbus thought he was in Asia. Cook misjudged Australia's size at first. Leif Erikson may have landed in North America and called it Vinland, then couldn't find it again. Even ancient Greek mariners, those pioneers of early navigation, ended up in all the wrong places but wrote very impressive poetry about it. In some traditions, getting lost was never even shameful. It was part of the process. The Polynesian term, imoana, to go out into the open sea, implies not just travel, but a kind of surrender to uncertainty. You set sail knowing you'll encounter the unexpected. It's only in later centuries that maps began insisting everything had a fixed location. That the world was clean labeled knowable. But exploration, real exploration, it was never tidy. It was groping in the dark, then telling stories about what you bumped into. You look again at your charts. You revise them not to match your expectations, but to match what is. You erase the ghost islands. You redraw the coastline based on what you've actually seen. You replace certainty with observation, and slowly something beautiful happens. You realize you do know where you are. Not in a coordinate sense, not in a send a message to port sense, but in a way that feels deeper. You're here, on this ocean, at this moment. Not lost, just not found yet. You think about the great age of navigation and how, despite all the instruments, much of it still came down to belief. Belief that land existed beyond the horizon. That a current would carry you home. That the stars were more than glitter, they were guides. You may not have found your island today, but you found your direction again. And sometimes that's enough to sail forward. You're sailing with purpose again, or at least the illusion of it. The sky is clear tonight, the kind of crisp, endless velvet that lets the stars show off just a bit. You lean on the rail spyglass dangling from one hand, and feel like maybe, just maybe, things are lining up again. Of course the stars haven't changed. You have. That's the thing about celestial navigation, it's as much about perception as it is position. You decide to give it another go. You pull out the sextant, polish the mirrors, and wait for Polaris to get cozy in the northern sky. There's comfort in that small white dot. It doesn't move, doesn't flicker, it just is. Your calm, indifferent, glacially distant compass needle in the heavens. You take your reading, not bad. Your hand barely trembles this time. Polaris helps with latitude. A true friend. Longitude, though, that remains trickier. It always has. That's where time comes in. And time, as we've learned, is rude and unreliable at sea. Historians still argue whether early mariners fully grasped the challenge of longitudinal positioning. Some evidence suggests they knew it was hard, just not how hard. Others say they knew exactly and just pretended they didn't, because trying and failing still beat standing still. Tonight you find your way by triangulating starlight and trusting the shape of the wind. It sounds poetic. It's mostly guesswork. But a kind of sacred guesswork practiced for centuries. You remember hearing about the ancient Polynesians again, how they could feel wave patterns against the hull and know which island was near. They memorized star charts with their bodies. They didn't calculate. They remembered. Western sailors, meanwhile, relied on what they could measure. Angles, minutes, shadows, charts, eventually clocks. But no matter the system, the goal was the same: to anchor yourself to something permanent in a world of movement. Some nights you succeed. Others, well, one sailor tells you about the lunar distance method, a mind-numbing system that involves measuring the angle between the moon and a star, then calculating your position using books thicker than your forearm. It works, he says. If you don't mind going mad, you decide not to go mad tonight. You're too tired. Instead, you fall into the rhythm of the ship. The timbers groan. The sails sigh. The world tilts gently from side to side like it's rocking itself to sleep. And above it all, those stars just exist. You get to thinking about how many navigators must have stared up at this same sky. How many fingers trace those same constellations? How many worried minds found calm in Orion's belt, or the slow rise of Vega in the east? There's something beautifully democratic about starlight. It doesn't care who you are. Rich, poor captain, crewman, it shines the same. It offers no shortcuts, no opinions, just presence. Even now, astronomers debate whether certain star maps from ancient cultures were purely spiritual or genuinely scientific. But does it matter? If something helps you find your way, who's to say what kind of knowledge it is? You decide to record the constellations again tonight. Not because you need to, but because it feels respectful. You sketch them in the margin of your map. Asterisms linked by shaky lines. Beside one, you write, "Maybe home is this way." And it hits you, maybe that's the point of all this. Not just to find land or chart water or make maps someone else will probably mess up later, but to connect. To know in the middle of nowhere that you're part of something bigger. Part of a tradition. Part of a story. Part of a shared attempt to look up, get your bearings, and keep moving. Even if you get lost. Especially then. Because every navigator, no matter how skilled, has had a night like this. A night where they weren't sure. A night where they stared at the stars not as tools, but as company. The wind shifts slightly. The sails adjust themselves with a sigh. You put away the sextant satisfied. Maybe you don't know exactly where you are, but you know where you aren't. You're not adrift, you're not panicking, you're not turning back. That's a kind of navigation too. Tomorrow you'll take another reading. Maybe the moon will cooperate. Maybe a passing bird will offer a hint. Maybe a piece of floating driftwood will tell you more than your compass. You'll trust what you can, adjust what you can, and write it all down in the logbook. Tonight, though, you rest. The stars are watching. They've got the night shift. Morning creeps across the deck like a gentle apology. The sea is back to its old habits, rolling slowly, reflecting the pale orange of the sky and pretending nothing ever happened. The stars are gone tucked away like secrets. In their place, a stubborn sun begins its slow climb. Warmth spreads over the ship's weathered wood, over your half-asleep crew, and over your salt-stained journal that now resembles a relic. Today is the day you find land, or rather land finds you. It starts with the birds, not the ominous storms a-coming birds. These are purposeful flapping with direction and routine. Land birds. You don't recognize the species, but they're not seabirds, and that's enough to make you stand up straight. You look ahead, squint, nothing yet, but you feel it in the air, the change. The subtle difference in temperature, the way the wind smells, just a bit greener, like sun-warmed leaves and something faintly sweet. You call to the lookout, he's already pointing, and there it is. A smudge, then a line, then a coast. You try not to grin, but your face betrays you. Even the captain, usually about as expressive as a damp boot, lets out a dry little chuckle and mutters, "Took our time." You approach slowly, cautiously. Everyone's suddenly very concerned with looking professional. Beards are combed, boots are shined, flags are hoisted at just the right angle. If this is going into the logs, and you're all going to look like you knew what you were doing. But here's the thing you didn't. Not really. You navigated by stars that half the time weren't visible. You guessed your distance. You guessed your heading. You logged corrections with question marks. You misread coastlines and argued with compasses. And yet somehow you made it. Historians still argue whether early explorers discovered lands or simply stumbled into them after a series of increasingly desperate educated guesses. Truth be told, it was both. Discovery isn't always a moment of brilliance. Sometimes it's a slow shuffle toward truth wrapped in confusion, hope, and stubborn optimism. You drop anchor in a calm bay, the beach curving like a welcoming arm. You can see trees tall and broad-leaved, swaying gently in a wind you can't yet feel. There's no visible settlement, no signal of other people yet, but you sense you're not the first to see this place. Not by a long shot. Still you row ashore. Your boots sink into wet sand, the kind that clings lovingly to your heels and insists on traveling with you. The first step is awkward. The second is exhilarating. You're here. Someone plants a flag. Someone else writes down the coordinates. The captain clears his throat and delivers a grand speech no one will remember correctly, and you start sketching. The coastline, the hills, the curve of the bay. It's rough, but it's honest. You label it cautiously. Uncharted shore. No bold names. Not yet. The breeze carries strange bird calls. The trees whisper. There's a heaviness to the quiet, like the land itself is watching curious. Not unfriendly, but very much aware. You think about the people who may already live here. The names this place may already have. The stories it holds. The reality that this moment so triumphant to you may simply be another footnote in a much older tale. You decide not to mark the place as discovered. You just write scene. Because discovery you're learning isn't about claiming. It's about witnessing. Later that evening, you sit by the shore and let the map dry in your lap. You've added a new coastline, updated your route, and drawn a dotted line back to the spot you thought you'd land 2 weeks ago. You connect it all. Every mistake, every correction, every maybe that somehow led you here. You realize now navigation is just storytelling with math. You chart what you see, you explain what you don't, and you build a world from fragments and hope. And when you're wrong, you change the ending and sail again. That night the crew drinks quietly. No raucous celebration, just relief. A gentle satisfaction that maybe they weren't as lost as they feared. The stars return soft and steady. They don't gloat, they don't remind you of your failures, they just shine. Like they always have. Like they always will. And you small sailor on a small ship in a big ocean feel not triumphant, but connected. To the water. To the wind. To every explorer who's ever asked where am I and meant it in more than one way. You close your eyes. You're not lost anymore. You're home enough. Now, as the waves soften and the night deepens, you feel the weight of the journey begin to drift away. Your body relaxes into the rhythm of the sea. The gentle rise and fall like the world itself is rocking you to sleep. The stars above blur just slightly, their light stretched like whispers across a dark velvet sky. You've traveled far, not just across maps and oceans, but through history, through the stories of those who searched before you. Sailors with salt in their veins and ink-stained fingers. Navigators who hoped the stars would speak clearly. Dreamers who sometimes found land, and sometimes just found themselves a little wiser for being lost. You remember the feel of old paper, the smudge of charcoal, the creak of wooden decks beneath tired boots? You remember laughter in the face of confusion arguments over clouds mistaken for land, and the quiet trust placed in distant lights no one could ever touch. It's all there tucked gently into your memory like folded sails after a storm. So now let your breath slow. Let the sea hush the last echoes of thought. Let your mind drift like a ship at anchor safe. And still knowing that even the most uncertain journey can lead to peace. You've done enough for today. You've wandered far and wondered deeply. And now it's time to rest. Close your eyes. Let the stars keep watch. Sleep well, traveler.